I'm going to record this program. So I would like to keep as generic as possible. So it is going to be recorded, and this is certainly um, available for public. There are few people they wanted to see this recording. They are not going to make it, so it will be useful for the community. All right. First of all, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining Sales CRM COE Roundtable. Today we are going to talk about data mastery discussion. So as we all know, data is a very critical component for any project, especially on a CRM project. It is becoming more and more critical because we are playing the most important functions, which are sales and service and marketing. They are the core function of any organization. So when you look at CRM data, I've been working with Salesforce for a while, and we have experts on this panel. We are going to talk about why is data so important for any CRM project, specifically whether it's a Salesforce or SAP or Microsoft Dynamics or any CRM system that you use. So we will discuss today about the need for understanding how to use it, how to protect, and so on and so forth. So we have great thought leaders today. Satish Padiyar, he works for HCSC Corporation. He's our Divisional Vice President, and he heads Data Analytics and Solutions section. And Satish has over 20 years of experience in the field of technology and business functions. And in the past, he played various leadership roles with the major corporations such as Caterpillar, McKesson, Ally Financials, and others in the area of data analytics, Salesforce, and other technology and business functions. The next thought leader we have Sovan Ben. He is a CEO and certified Salesforce technical architect from Odaseva. He is a former lead architect at Salesforce with 15 years of Salesforce experience. And he's a CTA with specialty on security and performance, and founded software company, Odaseva. So he's the founder and CEO of the company. Next, Brundage. He's a master architect and CTA from Odaseva, and he's got tons of certifications. I do not know how he gets the time with all the 4 kids he has got. So I'm so proud of him, and thank you for having him here. And he's a master architect, Salesforce MVP, Tableau CRM champion, and developer, group leader, speaker, and blogger. And he does have some life with all the things that he's doing. So he's an MBA and Salesforce certified instructor for analytics. So we are happy to have all of you today. And I just want to take 30 seconds to thank Deborah Maranta. She's the Chief Operating Officer from Odaseva. So when we wanted to put this together, I asked her, hey, can you help us out with the experts from your organization to talk about this topic? And she graciously accepted my invitation and talked to Sovan and Carl to make this happen. Finally, I lead CRM COE. This is a small initiative that I have taken along with some of the thought leaders to help the Salesforce or a CRM community, especially on the COE. As you see, COE is a very overused word or sometimes misused word. So we are trying to bring some discipline to the COE section of CRM. And I work for HCSC Corporation, as you see it, and I lead the Salesforce platform. All right, so let's get started. Today's discussion, we will briefly touch upon these points. When you talk about data, we have predictability is an important piece. Drive predictable and effective solution delivery by understanding the data. You got to understand the data. Unless you understand, there is no predictability. And then the second point here is, what about the quality of the data, integrity of the data, and condition of the data? And then you understand the data, you understand the quality condition, but what do you need to do to protect the data? And how do you measure and monitor data in production systems? Companies like us, we are a very large organization, especially the one I work for, multiple systems, multiple Salesforce instances. How do you make sure that you're protecting your data? And then data issues. Oftentimes you don't know whether there is a bug in the system or there is a problem in your data. We always, point to each other, oh, there is a data problem. No, this is not a data problem. This is a system problem. And then finally, we have, Satish and calls. They come from a data analytics background. So we are going to talk about, we produce a lot of data. I think I don't know, maybe you guys can help us out to understand the amount of data that we produce. We pollute the internet. I call it pollution on the internet. And we are literally polluting every day through devices, through your laptop and your web browser, whatever you call it. So we will see a little bit on that and improve decision making through data. So this is what we are going to be touching today. And let's get to the topic. I would like to talk about the importance of why. Why is it important to think about data first, right from the data, and as part of the core competency of COE? So if a COE leader putting together a program or in a matured COE, why should you think that COE leaders should be thinking the data as a front, center, and left of their initiative that they do? So I want to take this question to Sovan and see if Sovan can help us to understand your insight onto this particular question.
Thank you, Velu. So I'd like to start by sharing a customer story that I was part of. So back in 2008, when I was working at Salesforce as a program architect, I was helping a very large enterprise in Europe implement Salesforce, and it was for the first time in the world. We implemented the Center of Excellence with that particular customer. So 2,000 people would join the Center of Excellence, part of this global organization, to make this very strategic project a success. And since it was the first time, even though Center of Excellence theory has been trying to apply it in other projects, but not at a scale, and especially not in Salesforce. So we were asking ourselves many questions. And the way we structured the Center of Excellence at this time were based on the theory of organization of the large enterprise, where for many years they were structured by separating the people, the processes, and the technology. And the Center of Excellence will be at the center of those three areas, where they will structure an organization with the right skills, will be able to support the project, to implement the project, defining the business rules, and with the technology, in that case, it was Salesforce. And then along the years, we realized that companies now have a strong objective about customer experience. Customer experience is key at the executive committee level, where every company wants to maximize the customer experience. And when we realized that 80% consider that customer experience is more as important as product and services, this is how this should be prioritized. And how can you improve customer experience? First of all, you need to know your customer. So by knowing your customer, you have the data, and having the data will allow you to know your customer. So that framework, that where the Center of Excellence was kind of a copy paste of the global organization, where data was not the center, but something that we will use as a tactical level, suddenly become a strategic topic for large enterprise. So this is when the Center of Excellence adapted and embedded the data inside it. And we have seen a change also in global organization. Now we see, in addition to the CIOs, we see CDOs with the chief data officers. And that's why we see Center of Excellence who are embedding the concept of data into it. And if that customer experience is important, what the data will allow you to do is detecting when there is problem with the product by having insight on the behavior of the data so that you can improve it. You can customize the experience of the users because you know the customer, so you are able to adapt what you will say, what you will sell, etc. And basically, you can take action on this data. You can take decision for your own company, so beyond the customer experience. And there is a second topic why organization have put data at the center of excellence and globally organization is since 2018, we have seen a huge acceleration of data privacy regulation or data protection regulation. So it started with GDPR, the data protection regulation in Europe back in 2018. It continued with CCPA, as you know, in California in early 2020. And very soon in October, it's going to accelerate with another one in China. So global organization having activities over there. So basically regulation go faster than technology. So this is where the Center of Excellence can have a play. And through the technology, so if we take the example of Salesforce, we have the capability to work on both these customer experience through the angle of data, but also helping the organization comply with regulation through the angle of data once again.
Thank you. So, and I see two important points that customer experience, when you think about customer experience, data plays a major role, and then the compliance part of it. As a COE leaders, we want to make sure that we are protecting the customer experience. On top of it, we are also looking at the compliance part of it. And the compliance is a huge challenge for all of us. No, that's thank you, and it's an excellent point there. I just, before we move on to the next topic, Satish, you have done in your current life and the past life, you have done quite a bit of a CRM work. I got to know you a little bit more in terms of what you have done with CRM, and now you are running the customer analytics side or the data analytics side. So what's your take on COE leaders? What else they should be looking at when it comes to data, and why is it important for them to pay more attention now than ever?
Yeah, so thanks, Velu, and it's a pleasure to be here. Great to have such expert colleagues on as well, doing share of knowledge and information. I would say, in addition to all the excellent points that Sovan's brought up, the one thing that jumps out to me is, talking specifically about CRM, there's several dimensions to doing the work and essentially bringing excellence forward to the business of doing CRM. There's the technical component, right? Thinks about instances, that kind of stuff that really is an efficiency play. But then, to be effective, to really sort of get that quantum jump in terms of capability, I tend to think in terms of looking at complementary dimensions, things like what you just brought up, data and information, how you manage that, things like process, because that ties into the workflow that you're embedding through CRM. Change and adoption is another critical component that's intertwined with the others that I mentioned. So those complementary dimensions really are the ones that take you to the next level, right, in terms of doing CRM. And in many ways, because CRM is so, as you mentioned in your opening comments, so tied to business capabilities, so tied to how businesses face off to their stakeholders, to their external customers, it becomes really critical that success is not just table stakes. It's really starting to become a differentiator. So these capabilities, the way we think about them, really help with that, right? It's the adoption really defines how much of the usage of the CRM platform will benefit the business. So the more adoption one gets, the better, the more benefit one's going to have. Well, that's sort of coupled with how effectively the process that's embedded in the CRM ties to this. So while I called out several of these dimensions, in the end, it all boils down to data. So I was going to say, as a data and analytics guy now, I'm going to take a little bit of exception to, I know you're saying this a little bit tongue in cheek about pollution, right? But the point's well taken. I mean, we're generating a lot of data, petabytes of it. I think, there's a term used a lot called, from one of the thought leaders in the digital world, called digital dust. We leave these trails of, digital artifacts as we go through life. And I think the extent to which we're able to mine that and then make it part of the value story that we bring to life through data and analytics in the CRM world really differentiates us, right? So that's the complementary side of the value of thinking about data right from the beginning. It's traditionally been an afterthought, and sort of putting that at the front end of the process, designing it in explicitly in the same way that one defines and designs workflow and some of the other components, really makes for a much more successful outcome.
Great, thank you. No, I also face this when I've been working in this ecosystem for a while, and I say work with several clients. Whenever I work with COE leaders, and I'm part of a big COE leader group across the globe. I asked the last time when I talked to a few people, so we don't formally meet, and this is the reason why we started this process to meet with the COE leaders. I asked the question, whenever you do a project, whether it is an existing project or a new project, in the percentage of discussion with a strategic discussion, I'm not talking about your tactical discussion, what percentage of time that you allocate to talk about the data? Surprisingly, I'm not getting a lot of good answer, not consistent answer. So maybe call that, when we will go to the next topic. Now the data is a part of strategic plan. What actions should we build into the COE to deliver data success? So maybe call if you can give us some insights and wisdom that you have had or you are currently working with your customers.
Sure, thanks, Velu. When we think about the actions a COE wants to perform around data, it typically falls into two categories. And the first one is the data governance aspect of it. And to me, that's the more strategic aspect of it, where you're establishing the standards and the processes that you want to ensure that high quality data is always available. This may be things like your business definition, security rules, policy compliance, all those kind of high level tasks. The second aspect is to think about data stewardship. Now, this is more the tactical role, those activities that people will do to adhere to governance. So things like data quality monitoring, the data workflow. And what's interesting is the stewardship aspect, that's not necessarily embedded in the COE. You really want that as part of the teams that are using the systems, but you need to think about who are going to be your data stewards, who's going to be carrying out the day-to-day activities necessary to maintain data. Oftentimes it kind of thinks about, oh, well, we're gonna hire somebody, or we're gonna set up an offshore center to keep our data clean. Fortunately, from a stewardship perspective, that's so far from the business that you don't have success with that. And likewise, I think sometimes on the governance side, we think about, well, we're going to create all these binders of rules. You must do this. You must follow these things. And what happens is it just doesn't get followed, right? It becomes too onerous. I've heard examples of all these rules that you have to go through before you can add something to a CRM system. Well, guess what? In the meantime, the business is moving. So people come up with their own workarounds. They decide, well, it's going to take a month before I can get that field. I'm going to change the name of my accounts and put a star at the end, so I know that these are my focus accounts or something along those lines. So your processes can have the opposite effect of what you intended. If you want a different analogy, think about the data governance. That's kind of like the league of a sports team, right? They're setting up the rules, and then your data stewards, those are the referees. There's the ones that are carrying out what needs to be done. They have the action influence from the day-to-day perspective to make things happen.
No, it's an excellent point. I worked with a customer in the past in the East Coast, a very large customer, a financial service organization, pretty large amount of data. So it's especially the protection side, right? You have a data stewardship, governance, and the protection. So the VP of sales that I was working with, he was so adamant that any data that goes out of Salesforce, regardless of what data is, it could be a secondary data that you probably don't even care. You have to tell him why you want the data that's moving out of Salesforce. And so, so then the COE leader was, she had excellent pushback on what should go out of Salesforce and what should stay within the Salesforce. The COE, it was a very well thought out process, but they did this work before they went live. So very rarely you see that companies, before they go live, data governance, data protection is in place. That was his requirement. The person whom I was working with, he came from Merrill Lynch in New York area, and he was using Salesforce for more than 10 years. He was saying, without that, I'm not going live. You need to make sure that the COE help me to make sure that these controls are in place. So that's a great. So Satish, you have, would you like to add to this question?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, Carl brought up some great points, right? I mean, I think, of the dimensions I listed, data and information management, right? So the spot on. I mean, it's part of the scope of responsibilities I currently have had in prior roles. There's to zoom in on specifically some aspects of data governance and, master data management that are pertinent to CRM in particular, right? So, the construct of the customer master and the hierarchy of customers, right? I mean, that becomes really relevant. And making sure that the governance and the stewardship of the contact hierarchy and how those map to the customer hierarchy, right? Especially relevant in the context of B2B business set up CRM for B2B situations, or more complex B2B2C situations, right? Things like that. Thinking through that is upfront is super critical, because otherwise you end up having a bit of a nightmare cleaning up. I think Carl used the term workarounds. I mean, I tend to say it's sort of a spaghetti hairball conglomerate, right? And then you just end up expending a lot of effort and unentangling all of that, right? Because you end up with not thinking about it cleanly in terms of process, data, and how the two need to interact to be effective. So, I really think of these as two sides of the same coin. More and more CRMs are a core component of digital. So clearly, as digital and data, interact, the ability to think about both concurrently becomes important, right? Otherwise, generating a superior experience, making sure that relationship management, which is at the heart of CRM, is feasible, becomes impossible. So one other topic that's related, to the MDM topic I mentioned, whether it's customers or other kinds of master data, is a prerequisite often is reference data, right? So having the standard list of values that are available for you in your dropdown, the curation of those lists of values, right? So I mean, it's surprising how little attention that gets. In many situations, I've seen COEs tend to think in terms of MDM even because they've sort of understood the importance of that. But I don't think there's sufficient recognition that reference data is almost a prerequisite to be able to do master data well. So, thinking in that sequence of, you need one in the crawl, walk, run analogy, you need the RDM capability to be factored in first, layered in as you start to build out your MDM is another key insight that I've learned through the School of Hard Knocks sometimes. So.
Very good. Thank you, Satish. And let's move to the next topic. This is something, you got the data up and running, it's loaded into Salesforce, and now ongoing data operations governance, rather than thinking of data just one-time migration activity. This happens all the time. Especially when you do a new project implementation, or you are moving from Siebel to Salesforce, did I say Siebel, or any existing CRM to Salesforce. And so migration is a huge effort, right? You think that you load the data into Salesforce or any CRM or a Siebel or SAP or Microsoft. You think that is it's done, that hey, I moved the data. But the big challenge for COE leaders, what should they do in order to make sure that the data operations are going smooth? Carl, you and I had some conversation in the past. What's your thought on that in terms of the operations of this data governance?
I think when you look at a new project coming on as a COE, there's all this emphasis on, well, how do we get from that old system to the new system? And you spend an enormous amount of effort over a few months, 6 months, maybe a year, but you don't always think that then you're going to live with that system for years and years on end. So the time that you spend in ongoing data operations is so much more significant than just that initial piece. And data, as we talked about, being so core to the customer experience, it drives the speed of your organization having clean data versus dirty data. It helps you with enhancing your products because you can see how long somebody waits in the queue, or it helps drive revenue because you're not hunting for phone numbers, you know who to call. So all those things need to come in and be thought of from the operations standpoint of how are you going to produce that data? How are you going to use that data? So making sure you have the right pieces for data collection and keeping it clean on the way in. You're going to think about then taking that information and handing it off to like Satish's team, where you can analyze it. You can draw information and ultimately wisdom over time to make better decisions from your organization. And then a lot of times from an ongoing perspective, the data projects aren't always exciting. They may be something that you pitch and say, hey, we need to address some data quality issues. Well, no, I don't want to fund that type of project. I'd rather implement the CPQ system. So what you can do is you can take those pieces and you can embed it in the other projects. So think about it. Part of a CPQ system may be to say, well, we have to give a discount based off of the total volume with this customer. Well, that customer is spread across a parent account, a child account. There's some things going through a distributor. Unless you do a data project that creates that clean set of data that you know exactly what your customer is, your CPQ isn't going to be successful. So you, as a COE, look for those opportunities where there should be a good data component as part of that other activity, and then you can deliver a much more successful implementation.
No, thank you. Actually, I'm talking to thought leaders with CTA, and Satish has got a lot of background, a lot of experience. That we are talking about data. We are Salesforce or CRM folks, and imagine the amount of energy, the time, that investment that we have to make on the data. It makes our life is easier. It will be a lot easier to spend more time on the data at the beginning, rather than okay, just upload, migrate, integrate. Let's see whether you can create more opportunities, more leads, close deals. So we are so excited in creating opportunities and closing. Now, the question I have, this is for Sovan. Culturally, how are the companies moving towards data-centric versus a CRM feature-centric, whether it is an SAP or Oracle or Microsoft or Salesforce? Are these companies are shifting their paradigm of thinking, no, we are not talking about Salesforce or CRM features. we are talking about customer, which is a data behind it. What is the culture? Is there a cultural shift happening when you work with these large customers?
So I think there is a shift happening.
Mhm.
I've been in the Salesforce ecosystem for more than 14 years now. And when you look at the project, you will do the workshop, listen to the business, define the rules, then implement. And in most of the projects that I've seen in the 2010 years, the analytics part was at the end of the questions. Initially, it would be, how do you sell? What is your sales process? What is the stage one of your opportunity? And when do you move to the stage two? And in a way, when you would hire the consulting companies, you would implement the application, and at some point, the output will be data. But the input would never be the data. It will not be start by, let me know what is the current KPI that you're driving. And along the years, this has been a switch where we have seen more and more those questions early on in the project, where we would drive the project with the data. And data should not be just an output. If you, after implementing the whole process, what you will get is data related to the process. Maybe not the data would help you take decisions. So I think there is a change in the way the projects are evolving, but at the same time, this should come from the companies to drive those projects based on data. And when we were mentioning data migration, and we see it as a one shot and we move it from one place to another, now what we're considering is when the data is flowing across the environment, so you can have the data come in, you can have the data going out. So I was mentioning the data protection. I know we have a few questions around that, but what is important to remember is moving data from one system to another is you have to question the whole data protection around it. In GDPR, when you start moving data to another system, you should get the approval of the consumer. Because the revolution of data privacy is that the data does not belong to the company who have the data; it belongs to the end user, to the person who owns the data. So that was a big change, and I think all of those change from the data protection regulation or the fact that the data is flowing everywhere makes things different, and that's why the data is considered more as an input now in the projects.
Very good, thank you. So let's move on to the next topic. This is a very interesting one. I don't know whether there is the list will go on, I'm sure, when we talk about the typical data challenges, the COE will encounter. So when I started, wherever I go, first thing when I start the project, first thing is show me your data. Let me tell you whether your project will be successful or not. That I started asking this question even many years ago. There was a mentor that I was working with. He was from Detroit, and he always says, Velu, when you go to Salesforce project, if you are any CRM project, if you remember a call, Sovan and even Satish, there was 10 years ago when we started implementing CRM, there was a playbook. What are the questions you have to be asking? If you're a sales cloud or service cloud, these are the questions you'd be asking. But this mentor, he was my a kind of a lead person. He always says, Velu, part of this question, make sure that you ask the data questions. I did not understand 10 years ago when he said that. Why? This is, you just take the data and load it and it should work, right? But over the fast forward for the last 10 years, things have changed quite a bit. So if you look at the typical data challenges, I have tons of challenges that I wrote down, but probably I would rather hear from you guys, and you are the experts in this field. What do you see, and what are the challenges that you continuously, repeatedly see that? I'll start with Satish with respect to the data challenges and the COE. How should they encounter? How do they fix it? And what's your thought on it?
Yeah, I mean that's a great topic and probably a logical segue from what we were covering before, Velu. So thanks for that. I would say, I think you have listed here, some attributes of this, right? So you talk about the velocity, the volume, obviously the third V is the variety itself, different kinds of data coming in and being of interest, right? In the customer service context, for example, for CRM, you're starting to see folks capture different types of data structures. So that starts to get into the variety question a little bit, right? Sound clips, video, photographs, images, all kinds of other constructs of data that add to the data management challenge, so to speak. But overall, what I would say is, we touched on data, and clearly the next thing that comes with it is analytics, and going all the way to what called insight and wisdom. But bringing all that together requires the intelligence to be brought to that data. So having that be part of the challenge and thinking about that more holistically end to end becomes important. So if you begin with the end in mind and you say, what am I trying to define with the solutions that I'm creating as a COE, right? As a COE head, and work backwards from there. The answer becomes more apparent, right? It's easy to get lost in the grumble of all of the detail, but thinking through instead that you have data that's enabling an analytic, that's enabling an insight, which is then enabling a journey or an experience that you're trying to shape through CRM, then that becomes a very different kind of conversation, right? So different consideration as well. So those kinds of questions, I think, really solve for this very differently from the way they are currently. So that's basically what I would have to offer up.
Good. So what's your thought on it, Carl? In addition to what you see?
I think that aspect of starting with the business need, right? It all ties back to something that you're trying to do. And then you can start questioning, okay, well, what data do we need? How do we need to control that data? And then thinking about, okay, these are the systems that we're going to use to capture it, monitor it, report on it, do analytics on it. And we deploy that solution, and then we just keep enhancing, in an iterative fashion. And for me, there's some steps that you would typically go through, and it may sound silly, but starting with what are the common definitions? If you ask somebody what's a lead in your organization, you might get a lot of different answers, but it's the expression of interest in your products or services at some point in time. But people take it in a lot of different ways and model it maybe as a lead in Salesforce or as a contact or an activity. So there's that common definition. And then you think about, well, who's going to own this data? And that can change through the life cycle. Maybe it's sales and it hands off to service and comes back to sales for renewal. So owners can change, but thinking about that. Along those lines, how the data flows, how's it generated and used and modified. You're going to come up with a lot of information and a lot of thoughts. So it always goes back to that prioritization, looking for things that are high impact and low cost if you can, but definitely making sure you handle the things that are critical. Along the way, you have to build out your data stewardship support, right? Having that embedded team and giving them tools, whether it's a data quality score inside of a CRM or the monitoring reports, the things that they need to make it actionable. And then it becomes part of a regular process, right? You're not going to wait for some type of data crisis of, hey, we have this great report, but what's all this stuff in NA other that we don't have? You're doing it on a regular basis. You're backing up, you're deduplicating, you're archiving, right? Data has a life cycle to it. So you have to identify what should be the end of life and when does it need to leave the system because it's no longer providing value to you.
Gotcha. So when is it fair to say companies, because I used a word that may not be appropriate, polluting the internet with the data. Is it fair to say that we are bringing a lot of data into the CRM systems? Prevention is better than cure. So in terms of, if you, in your experience working with several clients, what type of, what percentage of people, just your understanding, I'm not asking for an exact number, in terms of the workforce in managing, controlling, protecting the data during, before, and after, in a typical CRM installation? Do you think it would be 10 to 20%, 15% of the workforce doing this work? Or, as Carl said, no, some offshore people or some afterthought, let's go fix this data problem. What do you see happening in the industry and other clients that you're working with?
So you know that Odaseva is specialized with the large enterprise. So we work with the Forbes 2000, the global Fortune 500 companies, so very large organization. And the cloud made a huge change in those organizations because before companies like Salesforce, if we talk about DRP, disaster recovery planning, a project would be managed by IT delivering to the business, but you would have a dedicated team specialized in infrastructure security, backup and restore, RTO, RPOs. So there will be a dedicated team. But the revolution with project like Salesforce is suddenly the team, the center of excellence who is in charge of delivering are not experts in those topics of DRPs or security protection because the assumption was that the provider will take care of it. So when it's true, when you have a Salesforce with data centers, that if there is a major problem in the data center, they will fail over to another one. They have backup, they have replication, etc. But that's for them. The companies is still at risk if they don't protect from themselves, right? So if you delete an email from Gmail and you empty the recycle bin, that's your fault. That's not Google's one. So it's the same here. Is the first years of the Center of Excellence where the assumption was that any risk was covered by the third party. When companies realized that it was not the case, this is when they started to embed those protection internally. And to the question, like what kind of data challenges we see in the different projects, on the business side, I would mention the adoption, because one of the main metrics that we follow for the success of a project is adoption. Like, do the user log in my system? But a user can log in the system and not read data, not interact with it, not edit it, not enrich it. So adoption could be measured as well from a data, because it would mean that your data is relevant to your own employees and thus could bring additional value to your customer. But as you said, when we pollute data because we have too much, like measuring the adoption of data would also allow you to detect which information is there that is polluting and preventing you to have access to the real, very interesting data right away. A second, when we were mentioning that tools can help you solve those challenges that were mentioned by Carl or Satish, whenever we're going to talk about tools, so here we mentioned, for example, the app exchange partners in the ecosystem of Salesforce, one of the main challenge will be security, because once again, like once the data gets out, every protection that you put in place suddenly disappear. And then there is a requirement for trust. And for many years, the trust was brought by ISO 27001, SOC 2 Type 2 compliance. So these are certifications that we have at Odaseva. We are certified by Ernst & Young, but those are only about the process. So a trend that we see in the market to remove that trust when we share the data with vendors is granular encryption, making sure that the vendor you work with, those tools that help you work on the data, are not able to see the data with their own employee, because otherwise it requires too much trust, which requires too much testing, penetration testing, and then discussing with them, and then that slows down innovation. So the trend that we see in the market, and you can see it with Salesforce Shield platform encryption, or Odaseva, is the data is encrypted at the column level, at the row level. Every file is encrypted separately with a key with the customer, so that by removing the trust, then you can have fully trust because they cannot see the data. And the third element that I would mention as a challenge is, especially with mature organization, is large data volume. So large data volume is a topic that is heavily addressed in the architect certification of Salesforce, because whenever you have such value in the data, at some point you might have too much. And if Salesforce has amazing scalability, at the same time, if you have a lot of data, the use case you have might be challenging with the LDV, this large data volume. So addressing this concept of large data volume, like first of all, you could remove the noise, like you said. But the second part is how to handle those APIs to be able to extract all of those data without breaking the limits of the system. And this is when you work with the architect in your center of excellence to make sure that all of your integration, all of your development scales as long as your data scale at the same time.
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate
So
it. I think.
Velu, if I may, that
Go
I
ahead.
just want to add one quick
Go ahead, Satish.
thing there. So I think Sovan had some excellent points on the impact of this. I sort of chuckled because the intertwining of the two topics, right? Carl brought up the topic of definitions, and so in a CRM implementation, global multi-business unit with sub BUs, etc. There was this dichotomy where there was polar opposite definitions of pipeline stages, right? So you had, in the vast majority of the cases, a lead progressing to an opportunity, but then there was almost this, lack of a better term, a religious war, where there was a small set of renegades, call them, that said, no, you start with an opportunity, becomes a lead. And so, being the COE leader, the challenge was to sort of broker peace and say, I think it was a little more challenging than solving for Middle East peace, but really it just came down to making the case to say, it's great, it's a problem to have no standards, but there's only one thing worse, and it's to have more than one, right? And so I think that really was the selling argument to get people to comply and basically say, look, we have a hierarchy of process stages. At an enterprise level, we cannot have diametrically opposed definitions, right? So you need to get clarity. So that point really resonated. And then tying that to, I think, some of the points Sovan was making real quick, I had to laugh. There's this classic anecdote of MDM problem, right, with quality for master data about customers, where national bank in Argentina was collecting information about customers and just asking all the tellers in their bank when they interacted with customers to record their profession. And the bank president was really puzzled because the number one profession that their bank's customers self-identified, was astronaut. Except Argentina does not have a space program. And so, it sort of talks to the need to intertwine carefully process and data, because the problem with the workflow was the teller just got a task added as a chore that said, you need to ask this question of every customer. The customer was impatient because they were anxious to basically get past the question and get to the real business, right? So talking about the importance of thinking about these things in the context together of the journey and the customer experience. And so by default, the customer would say, just fill in whatever you want. And the teller would hit click. And the first pick on the drop-down list was astronauts. So you had all of a sudden a very large population of Argentinian astronauts. So I thought I'd share that anecdote to sort of bring together the story of the CRM and data needing to intertwine to create a superior customer experience or not, and the ill effects if you don't do it right.
Oh, I can imagine and understand where you're coming from, Satish. We have about 7 minutes, so we have 2 more questions, and then we should be able to wrap it up. We talked quite a bit on the data protection. This is the question for you guys as an expert. Should we define a RACI? Who is responsible in a CRM project with respect to who owns the data, who's responsible for quality, who's responsible to protect the data, who's responsible if something goes wrong, who is responsible to restore? Have you seen one? If not, in your opinion, should we define a RACI in terms of CRM projects, specifically for data related? I'm talking about data related RACI.
Yeah. So this is Satish. I can take a quick stab at that. I'd say yes. I mean, I think we need one. I don't think there's a hard and fast rule. Obviously, it's contextual, and it really depends on the org structure and whether certain functions exist. I'd say, in my opinion, for the kind of mid to large Fortune enterprises that we were discussing in context to date, the best practice seems to have emerged as you sort of clearly separate responsibilities for transactional systems from analytics type use cases, and you have the the responsibility for the transactional system and the data embedded in it sort of lining up with the CRM team, right? So the team that's doing that with appropriate resource allocation. But then you complement that with looking enterprise-wide at data more as an asset and obviously feeding into CRM, so sort of matrixed in, and having a dedicated complementary COE or team that's responsible for doing data governance, data quality, data stewardship at an enterprise level that's going cross-domain, right? And I think the two together, working together really create the end-to-end, right? So
Very
provide coverage.
So 30 seconds for you, Carl, 30 seconds for you. So, and in terms of, do you agree that we should have RACI to manage the data?
I think you take the RACI, but you have to break it into data subcategories, because I heard you describe a variety of activities. Something like data stewardship is going to be in the team that's actually using the system. It's not going to fall up on the COE, but the COE should be providing the common means for you to protect your data and do a restoration. So the different aspects of data are going to fall in different places in the RACI.
Great. How about you, Sovan?
I agree with Satish and Carl. I would also add that in addition to the internal RACI, it's also important to have an understanding of the global RACI. What is your responsibility as a company? What is the responsibility of the vendor? Back in 2005, every customer thought that Salesforce backup was enough. And if they were doing a mistake, Salesforce will recover the data, which was not true. So this misunderstanding between the shift of responsibilities between the cloud vendor and the company is very important. If Salesforce is down, so Salesforce responsibility will be to recover the data center. But if you need only 5 minutes of downtime in the year because your system is super critical, then this is your responsibility to bring 99.999% and find a vendor for that. So that's why once the RACI, the global RACI is well understood, then you can work on the internal part and distribute the responsibilities across the team.
Thank you. So this is our last question. We have 3 minutes left. Data consumption. This is always input versus output, right? I come from a traditional technology, computer science background. There is an input, process, output. We are producing a lot of data. The question, Satish, all of you, especially you, each one of you comes with a lot of experience with the data analytics. Forget about the CTA part of it, the CRM side of it, the Salesforce side of it, just the data itself. We are consuming, we are producing. The question is organization consuming it, and are they making use of the data? And if so, if you can answer who needs this data, CRM data, outside of the CRM users, and why do they need it? How do you ensure that they are protected outside of this? This is a pretty loaded slide, but if you can take if you give us a 30 seconds or a minute or so, that'd be a great insight to the audience.
Sure. So Velu, I think I'd sort of summarize and say, CRM is so, in the broadest sense of the term, I think it's really applicable enterprise-wide. So I'd say everybody, but in context, right, needs access to it in some form. In many cases, it's refined and probably, they're probably looking at it more in aggregated form or processed in some way. The why, I mean, it's contextual, right? But in general, I'd say to inform how they impact and are impacted by relationships with customers. I mean, that's the acronym, right? So by definition, that's how it comes in. And there's a whole litany of reasons underneath that would need more time to click into. And then the last part is, how do you ensure CRM data is protected outside of the CRM? I mean, I think some of that comes down to what we've touched on before with data governance, things like that, and sort of thinking more specifically about that transition as you go from, if you think about CRM as a transactional system, which it begins with, right? I know there's analytic use cases in there, and then you flow it through, then very often some of the downstream usage of this data really starts to get more into the analytic pattern where you're trying to munge data coming out of a CRM with other subject area type data sets, right? Financial information, other type classes of data. And so I would say, very often it's being transformed and refined with those additional subject areas and context when you're taking it outside of a CRM. So there's no guarantees, but having good controls over the logic and the protecting the way that you're doing the transformations as you progress this really is the way to ensure protection in that sense.
Great. So now the question is it's a straightforward question. I don't know whether you will have an answer. So I'm going to make this one as a tough one. We produced X amount of, let's say 2 terabytes of data. Are we consuming 2 terabytes of data? What is the trend? What are we seeing? You're producing it. How well are we consuming the data? And all the, I would not call it hype, all the emphasis that we put in on the data analytics, is it truly, are we going in the right direction in terms of consumption? So what do you think, Sovan?
Well, like you mentioned at the beginning of the call, there is a lot of noise. We see the trend of customers growing data. One of our customers since 2013 started around 500 million records in Salesforce. Now they have 8 billion. So the quantity is exploding. Every statistic all around the world says that the data is all over the place. Now the difficulty is to get value of it, which I raised the topic of adoption. How can you measure adoption of data? If data is neither used in analytics, neither used by a user, what you should do about it? So when we released the archiving solution with Odaseva, the intent was to help customers get rid of the noise that they still want to keep, just in case they still have some doubts, but right now they're not using it and it's damaging the rest of the application. It slows down, it makes it harder to find the right information. So I would say there is a challenge for, I would say, the all tech industry, that we all produce more data, we all provide tools that help measure it, but we are yet to see how well we are going to succeed by having both the quality, the quantity, and the tools that only analyze those specific data that make sense to the business.
Great, thank you. So we are 2 minutes past call. We are going to close this out with your insight and wisdom. If you were to advise the COE leader, what are the top 3 things you will say from just like that from your head? Okay, these are the 3 things you should always keep in mind if you're a sales CRM COE leader.
I think the first thing is don't forget about the data, right? It's easy to focus on the systems, but we're here to talk about data. So you ask those questions at the start, in the middle, at the end, all the time. What about the data? From that, the second piece is data isn't something you have to do alone. We put a lot of responsibilities on COEs and leaders to be experts in all these things, but you have to ask the questions and then look for the teams that are there to support you, whether it's in your organization or externally. And then last but not least, I think there's truth in data. Data doesn't really lie. Data is kind of that hard, fast rule, so you can find some comfort or solace in what the data actually tells you.
And great insights. Thank you. I think I'm going to make this and post it in my internal team. So first of all, thank you, gentlemen, for joining. It's been great having you on the panel. Anybody who is listening or watching this session, if you need to reach out to any of our folks here, there is a LinkedIn, and I may not have done a good justice of explaining their background or their profile. They are much more than what I could explain in 30 seconds. So feel free to reach out to them if you have questions, and certainly call Sovan, Satish. Thank you for joining. And we certainly would look forward to having you sometime in the future.
Yeah,
Okay.
a pleasure. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Have a good day. All right. Talk to you soon.